Well, hello again, David Willey again to answer some questions and catch up on a few little issues. And at the very beginning, I just want to say thank you so much to all the various people that have been supporting us. I just picked one of the names out. We've got so many people that thanks for buying things. I just picked out the name here, Michael Galash, who's out, I believe, in Germany. Thanks so much for the stuff you've been buying from our shop. And I know you're one of the people that came to one of our Tiger Days, and we hope you see you at better times at the museum again, but thanks very much for that. I also just wanted to catch up with people. A lot of you have asked about how's David Fletcher, is he okay, where is he, etc, etc. Now, unfortunately, we don't think David, we did have a think about this one, but where he is, his internet connection, his computer and various other things, we don't think it's going to work to be able to try and do live broadcasts, or not live, but, you know, recording films with him. But I'm in regular contact with him, and this is what he just wanted to say to, I'll read out for everybody. Thanks to everyone who's inquired. I'm quite well at the moment, even if I'm imprisoned in the flat. I'm still being well looked after. I'm allowed out early in the morning to go for a walk in the woods. For the rest of the time, I'm writing about armoured vehicles, of course, for various magazines, both here and in the USA. Not that I shan't be unduly sorry when this business is over. So his warm regards to all of you, David Fletcher. So DF's okay, and fingers crossed it won't be too long before we can all start be back in the museum and doing our usual things. Now, just a couple of things. I forgot the other time when I did a question and answer, I had it hanging behind you. A number of people asked about what that coat I was wearing when it was a bit nippier out here. I think I was sitting out here actually right by the compost heap as well, as I was last time. Yeah, this is what they call a Canadian Army Mackinaw. And it's a big, thick, heavy canvas coat, wool lined, and this particular one, it said Dominion Garment Company, 1952. It was made size 44, 45. And they're lovely, great big, very, very warm things. And I know some of you are interested in those. Not the same, bit similar, but not the same as the American Army Jeep coat or Mackinaw that was done in the war years, which is a blanket collar. There was something like this the Canadians had in the war years as well. This one's just a post-war one. So if you're a bit of a coat person like I am, or you like this sort of stuff, that's one of those nice and warm, thick winter coat ones that I'll drop behind me. So forgive me, I forgot to mention it the last time. I had it hanging behind me. In fact, actually, I did mention it because these things that sometimes happen. I'm just going to check now. Yeah, what we sometimes do is, of course, I sat there to camera, answered loads of people's questions, did everything, only at the very end when I checked the battery had gone on one of these microphones, and which all the fun and games of doing that you know, was quite irritating. I did actually mention all about that coat and various other things which I've now completely forgotten about. Anyway, right, on to some of those questions people have asked. So one of them was a number of people, not an individual, a number of people have asked, what's that bulge in the middle of a tank barrel? What does that do? Now that bulge is something they call, some countries call it a bore evacuator, some a fume extractor, and I've done my, here we go again, the Acme fume extractor demonstrator model coming out here. The idea is, what normally happens is when a round goes in the breech of a gun, and oh, by the way, if you're interested in what this is, just see, here's our demo round, 17 pounder, armor piercing, capped, ballistic cap, this one. Black, 2 white bands means it's armor piercing, red means there's explosive in it. This, you'll be pleased to see, this is actually an inflatable 17 pounder round from our shop, so you can get these from our shop, rather nice things. And we've also got, there's a Tiger round there as well, they do them. So if you fancy one of those. So back to my demonstration. The idea is, obviously the round goes in the breech of the gun. The brass case here contains a propellant, which is basically explosive. Once that is ignited, when it burns, it creates a huge amount of gas which expands rapidly in the space, and that's what shoots the round out the other end of the barrel downrange towards the target. Now, or in modern ammunition, some people are asking about two-part stuff and everything, sometimes this brass case is replaced by a bag of explosive, so it doesn't actually have, or it has a stub piece of brass and then the rest piece on the top there, and again the rounds in the chamber as well. So what if we can imagine this is the tank barrel, what happens, he says, if I can get the thing out, oh, it seems to be stuck, hang on. So what happens is, there's my cigar tube, which is a pretend round goes in, the barrel breech is closed, so it's plugged. So when that is ignited and that top piece fires down the barrel to go out the end, exiting down there, all those hot gases that are expanded so rapidly are forcing the round down the barrel as it works down towards before it exits. Now, the problem is those gases, when they actually form, there's a lot of toxicity in those gases, as well as the fact there's smoke and things that will just catch your breath on, etc. So what you don't want to happen is when you open the breech, after that round's been fired, when you open the breech, you don't want all those gases coming back into the turret. Now, early days, there were things like what they called Sirocco fans put on the roof of the turret that would actually suck out the air and take it outside, so if the fumes are in there. But with the bigger rounds, post-war, when we're looking at you know, 105 especially, then 120, you're looking at a lot of fumes and a lot of gases, etc., that could go in, and again, we're much more health and safety conscious. So they've got to find ways of, let's not let the guys in the cab, in the turret, actually get to breathe in all those fumes. And that's where this the bore evacuator or fume extractor comes in, this bulge that's down the barrel, because as that round is going down that barrel, what we have to think about, what's going on is underneath here, this is a sealed chamber, that little tin box or tube that's going around the actual barrel. And the idea behind it is, as the round passes that particular bulge, there's holes, if we look underneath, there's holes are drilled into the barrel. And those gases that are forcing the round down the barrel expand through the holes and go into this chamber, which is like a capturing chamber that therefore fills as well with some of that pressurized gas. The round continues, and as it exits, if it would exit, this one seems to like staying in there, my cigar tube. Anyway, let's just imagine the round's come out the end and it's disappeared down there. Now, as soon as that round exits, all those hot gases have a chance of expanding outside. Okay, so the pressure that's been built up to force the round out is now dissipating because it's actually can go out into the general atmosphere. So we've still got in our chamber here that high pressure gas that's gone in there through those holes. So momentarily, and we're talking about microseconds now, as soon as all this gas is expanding out the front here, this pressured gas forces its way back through holes, and the front holes in that chamber that are drilled right the way through to the barrel, to the inner part of the barrel, they're angled to face forward. And so this pressurized gas here now vents through these holes and pushes air, or the gases rather, all the way down the barrel, forcing what smoke and other fumes remain to go out that way. So again, when you watch a tank gun fire, quite often you'll see that recoil and then the round's left, and then there's this little almost afterthought of a puff that comes out momentarily later out the end. And that's that pressurized gas that's actually being pushed down to the end there. And hopefully that's the aim, or scientifically it obviously works, is that is then sucking out any residual fumes going out that way, rather so that when they open the breech at the other end, rather those fumes go back inside the turret at all. That's the whole idea of a bore evacuator, fume extractor as it's sometimes called, that bulge all the way down the barrel. Now of course, if you don't have people in the turret, you don't have to worry about doing this. So if you look at the latest Armata T14, the Russian tank, it hasn't got a bore evacuator on that barrel at all because they're not so worried about those fumes coming back in the can. And there are other ways you can get rid of the fumes. Some have got this idea, you have pressurized air is squeezed in to the breech end, and that is actually then, once the gun's fired, pressurized air put in to blast any fumes going the other way. But I hope that answers that question with our Acme little device there. Now, what were the other questions? Thank you very much. Those of a couple of people who actually offered to translate that Greek writing that was inside that tanker's helmet. Mike, our Greek intern, who's now back out in Greece. Hello, Mike. Thanks very much he's done that for us. So that was, but thanks very much for the offer there. One of the, I can only describe it as perhaps less cheery subjects that somebody's brought up, which is this idea about what happens when people are killed or wounded in tanks. And you know, let's just all hope you had your breakfast and everything, but it's worth a mention, because this idea, you know, we talk about these subjects, and I know there was somebody sort of put it as a bit of criticism as well, which is, here we are, we gas about helmets, we gas about all these other things as if it's just you know, our toys, our fun, our collecting. We should never, and I'd like to think if you come to the Tank Museum, you don't ever disassociate the subject area, as in our enthusiasm for the machinery, the uniforms, the kit and everything else, with what it is actually used for, and that end result on an awful lot of young people that have had to fight in wars over time, especially in tanks. And why I mentioned that, because, you know, one of the questions was what happens about people inside bodies, and or people inside tanks that have been killed, or, you know, the question was, somebody surely has got to go along and clear all this up sometimes. And that took me back, because I remember we had a chap called Ron Huggins, who was a volunteer when I first came to the Tank Museum. He'd been there for quite some time, and Ron and Harry Webb, they used to drive around in our Sherman all the time at demonstrations, two wonderful gentlemen. But Ron used to come along to the Tank Museum at half terms, etc., lay out a table of some of his kit and talk to everybody. He loved talking about, you know, what he did in the war and everything. And Ron saw a lot of action. He was out in the BEF in France 1940. He fought with the 10th Hussars at Huppy. He fought across North Africa. He was there when von Thoma was captured. He fights in Italy, and like so many of these, he becomes a regimental sergeant major. Like so many of these guys afterwards, well, that sense of caring for the men, he took that on into civilian society, and he went into social work, and he looked after people, you know, putting people back on the straight and narrow, etc., in those post-war years as his later career. Now, Ron was a lovely guy, and I remember one time he told this story, and I remember he got a bit worked up when he was telling it, and I think it's written up, and I'm not sure, it might be in the Gideon, which is the 10th Hussars Journal, but a lot of his accounts he actually did write down, and they were published. But I remember he told us this story, and he said he was out this was when they were in North Africa fighting, and there was a convention between the British and Commonwealth troops and the Germans when they were fighting there, that you buried your opposition's dead, you know, at the end of any engagement. And I can't remember how this actually, the communication occurred, but what happened is Ron's unit, 10th Hussars, they come across some of their own knocked out tank from an earlier engagement, and the bodies are still inside and they're in a real state. And they got a message, and this is what I can't remember how it worked out, to the Germans, saying, listen, this isn't on, in this sort of chivalry, that the way the war was being fought between the British and the Germans out there. And the message came back from the Germans apologising, saying, look, we would have done that, but the circumstances at the time, whether it was engagement or something, they just didn't have the time to do it. But they actually apologised for that. And Ron remembers this and being quite affected by it. But his CO actually asked for volunteers to go and actually remove the bodies from these tank wrecks. And Ron, being the sergeant, thought he had to volunteer. And he came out with a line, I remember when he was talking to us, getting quite emotionally, as you can understand, sort of involved in this. And he said one of these tanks had been one of his best mate's tanks. And he said he could only identify his best mate in that tank because he recognised the guy's wristwatch, which was on this burnt bit of an arm sort of thing. And I say that because I don't want to put you all off your breakfast and everything else. I don't want us to sound like we're always going to do a downer on these things, but I think that's one of those other areas where, you know, take all this in, play the games, do whatever you like that way, but please don't ever disassociate it from the real end result of some of these things. And to specifically answer, and again, I hope I'm not going overboard here, but this was a quote that also I came across just the other day, not specific to tanks, but some poor sod's got to do this. So remember, when all that battle's over, this was Sergeant Donald Hagel, an American Army soldier who was from the Graves Registration Unit, and this is what he writes. Sure, there were lots of bodies we never identified. You know what a direct hit by a shell does to a guy, or a mine, or a solid hit with a grenade even. Sometimes all we have is a leg or a hunk of arm. The ones that stink the worst are the guys who've got internal wounds and are dead about 3 weeks with the blood staying inside and rotting. And when you move the body, the blood comes out the nose and mouth. Then some of them bloat up in the sun. They bloat up so big that they just bust the buttons, and then they get blue and the skin peels. They don't all get blue, some of them get black, but they all stunk. There's only one stink, and that's it. You never get used to it either. As long as you live, you never get used to it. And after a while, the stink gets in your clothes and you can taste it in your mouth. You know what I think? I think maybe if every civilian in the world could smell this stink, then maybe we wouldn't have any more wars. So that's from someone who was there and who was doing it. So one of those ones I just, think we always just need to keep that and bear that one in mind, that there's a cost to these things and how they work. Ron Huggins, by the way, one of the other stories he told us, which is people have asked about improvisation and everything with crews and how they went to do things to improve their lot. One thing Ron did was he was conscious, not just with dead bodies, but wounded soldiers. How do you get them out of the tank? And he got his LAD, the Light Aid Detachment team, to actually make up some what they just look like is enormous boot hooks that used to be used to pulling on leather boots, etc. They were just basically metal U shapes, fairly large, with a T-bar across the top. And these he used to actually put under the arms of wounded soldiers, or in worst case a dead body, and so they could pull them out the hatches. Again, if somebody's wounded or they're unconscious and they're slumped, this idea if you can't grip their uniform or whatever, or those straps as we talked about in the tank uniforms, that idea of being able to pull them out. And Ron got our own workshop guys to mock up a couple of those, which he used to put on the table and talk about. So, he made them again. Right, moving on, let's go to a different direction. A number of people have talked about what's the history of the Tank Museum, why did it get going, etc. If you go on our website, there is actually a link there to a brief history of the museum, but just as a quick outline, the Tank Museum's based at Bovington. Bovington is where they came in the First World War to train. It's in Dorset, southwest of England, well away from most, fairly big conurbations. There was a train line down to that way, so they could bring the tanks on railways, which is where you transported tanks and still do quite often. That idea of then offloading them, they drive to what was just before the First World War, was a training area for the territorials, or the militia, the sort of like the weekend soldiers. Initially Bovington was used to train infantry, but then because of its location, well away from the public eye, there's not many people living in the area, so secrecy was important, but they also looked at the terrain because it was really open heathland, and if you took up a lot of that, it wasn't particularly good for food production, for the war effort, etc. So all of these things came together. So Bovington in 1916, later in 16, is chosen as a place to do most of the training. They've already been at Bisley, they go off to Elvedon up in Norfolk, where the first tank crews leave to go in that attack in the Somme. But later in 16, that's where Bovington comes to the fore, and that ends up becoming the main centre for training tank crews. Most of those tank crews that trained at Bovington would actually go out to France and meet your tank straight from the factory, or other methods of getting them out there by ship and by train. You didn't actually take your own tanks with you, as it were. The ones at Bovington ended up being used mainly for training. Now Bovington expands. I've mentioned in a previous talk, later in 1918, Bovington is doubling in size, ready to train all these crews, ready for Plan 1919. And it's going to become an even bigger camp. It was big in the First World War. It took up, first of all, it used to fire where the main camp is, and it went down to Lulworth and took some land there as well, so that it could use its guns, 6-pounder guns, etc. And after the First World War, Bovington is where all those tanks that were still serviceable came back, or weren't scrapped immediately, came back to Bovington. And that was also a place where, yes, they carried on training with some of them, but huge numbers of them, there's photographs, fields of these things lined up, were then being slowly scrapped. And I think I mentioned somewhere else that, I think it's as early as 1932, they're still scrapping First World War tanks because there's so many of these things that come back that way. Now, the story is, And this story was published in Tank magazine, which was a journal for the Royal Tank Corps, in the later 20s. It said in 1923, Rudyard Kipling, on a visit to Bovington, saw these tanks being chopped up, etc., and said, shouldn't you keep some of those? They were an amazing war, you know, not war winning, but an amazing contribution that Britain made to the First World War. And I think already there was probably the idea of a teaching collection anyway that was down there for the NCOs and everybody else to say, this is what we did, or this is why we've learned it better, or this is what we don't do anymore. Anyway, the story goes, it's Kipling's suggestions that starts in 23 the idea of the museum, or a collection, probably a better way of putting it, being put together. Now, I've actually asked a number of Kipling scholars, looked at all the correspondence, etc. We've got no evidence at all that Kipling actually was there at Bovington. We do know Kipling has an excuse to come down to this neck of the woods because Thomas Hardy, the author's nearby, T. Lawrence living up the road at Clouds Hill, etc. There's a whole load of people around here that Kipling does correspond with or knows. So there is a good excuse for him to be in this neck of the woods, but we've never found absolute proof that it was Kipling visiting that says this. What interests me, though, is the fact this was published in the Tank Journal as mentioning Rudyard Kipling being the instigator before Kipling's even dead. You would have thought someone else would have written in quite quick saying, hang on, this is Tosh, or Rudyard Kipling doesn't say that was the case, or something like that. You know, so you've got a gut feeling that it's probably a true story. It's just we've got no other evidence apart from this publication to say that, to really back it up. But anyway, the story really is that about 30 key vehicles are placed within a wooden compound or fence, and these are the beginning of the collection. And what happens is as a vehicle goes out of service or something experimental comes to the end, there is a tendency it ends up into this collection. And again, there's a lovely film that was done just at the end of the Second World War called Men of Armour, where you can see inside what was our World War II hall that was being used, or at least half of it, for the museum collection. RAC soldiers talking about their operations in World War II. Young soldier comes down, talks to an old World War I veteran, and you can see some of the collection all around. It's a lovely little bit of film. Got a young Joss Ackland acting as a young soldier as well in it. So, you know, that idea that it's really a teaching collection for the soldiers is the first thing. Only, I imagine there was open days, you know, you see these pamphlets, all these things going on. But this idea that it's only post-war that it starts ending up turning much more towards the civilian, the tourist who's coming to Dorset on holiday, etc. And someone else asked about George Forty. George Forty with the Royal Tank Regiment ends up as a colonel, fights out in Korea. He was the guy that really turned the collection over from just being something that was aimed very much at the soldier. He tried to professionalise it much more to aim at the general public, and you can see some of those early photographs, you know, when the the place was just heaving with kids every summer, you know, climbing on everything, doing all the things that way. Then after George sadly died a couple of years ago, he wrote a lot, he corresponded with lots and lots of soldiers, and he put together a really lovely pictorial history of the Royal Tank Regiment, etc. And after George, then it was John Woodward who was the director, who again was that idea of the trustees at the time about trying to look, you know, we get a good annual average visitors, etc., but slowly over time it's going down. The world around us was changing, so the idea about what's going to make a real difference to put the Tank Museum on the map, and how are you going to raise money to be able to do things to make it not just a lovely collection, as so many of these military museums are. You know, they've got great collections, but they're not necessarily good museums. They don't necessarily interact with the public very well. You know, it's great if you just love the stuff and you just want to see it in rows. That was fantastic in those days, but it wasn't going to keep a family entertained, or it wasn't going to bring in the money that you need to do to sustain a good proper collection into the future. So those changes started back in the 1990s, and that have led, you know, with the support of the Lottery, the Arts Council, various other bodies as well, led to the museum as it is today. But go back and have a look at that on our website. It tells you a little bit more information about how the museum got going and that idea of the collection. And also, you know, there's certain periods where just after World War II, lots of captured equipment was handed over in about 1951, and that still goes on. So equipment that's, you know, Gulf War, once, you know, Operation November it was called, a lot of captured equipment from first Gulf War. Once that had been analysed, it was the first time we got hands on large quantities of Soviet era kit. Then what do we do with it afterwards? Some of it went for gate guards, some of it, goodness knows, what are we going to do with it now? And some of it ends up at the Tank Museum, including, I have to tell this story, overnight, tank was actually left in the car park at the Tank Museum because no one knew what to do with it, and let's get rid of it with them. When the unit concerned were rung, apparently the story goes, I wasn't there at the time, but they apparently said, nothing to do with us. You know, the CEO had basically said, get this rusty item off our patch. Ends up in the Tank Museum car park. And we said we knew it was you because it's actually on the side, captured by, was still painted on the side of that particular unit. So anyway, so another, you know, countless stories about how we acquire things as well out there. So that's a little bit about the history of the actual museum. I've mentioned, I think, most of the other ones. I was just going to say that this morning. I'm sorry if I can't answer all the questions. Some of the questions that are coming, they're just not that easy for me to be able to do in the current circumstances. You want either more props or I haven't even got a printer here, so I can't always, you know, put something together that's going to illustrate what needs illustrating as a topic. So some of them, you know, I know you've asked a couple of times, some people, some of them aren't ones I'm going to be able to do in these circumstances, but do keep asking if there's things we can clear up for you or you know, add to your picture of different things. And there was another one I was going to mention, see if I can raise him at the moment. A lot of people want to say hello to Finn the dog. Finn, come here, come on, come around here, come around here. Come up here a minute. This is Finn, who's my border collie, who most of the time sits there and falls asleep when I'm waffling on, as I no doubt some of you are now. But yeah, so this is Finn. I know you wanted to meet him. Thank you, Finn. You've done your bit. So keep the questions coming. Thank you, I repeat again, those of you who are supporting us with either joining the Patreon scheme, buying something, buy your inflatable shell from the shop, like I say. There's plenty of other good, nice items there, so do have a look at that. And as I say, thank you so much. I know some of you have spent a fair bit of money in the shop, or you're finding ways to support us. We really are appreciative of that, so and keep it up. Thank you.